You're looking for a period adjacent adventure romance that turns history on its head in the vein of Ella Enchanted or A Knight's Tale, but something with less boho chic and more cursing. Let's talk My Lady Jane, which I was woefully behind on even knowing was getting an adaptation from Amazon Prime, which is now streaming because it is a 2016 novel, which you probably know at this point, by Cynthia Hand, Brody Ashton, and Jodi Meadows, which were all and continue to be big names in the YA space, especially when this came out in 2016. And while this book set off a number of follow-ups, both within the Jane trilogy and the Mary trilogy, this was the book that started everything. And as a bookseller in 2016, and 2016 being the year I went to Book Expo America, the one and only time I went to Book Expo America, I was really in the game at the time and very, very excited about this book. This was back in a time where I did care about arcs, and I wanted the arc of this book so bad. I was unable to acquire an arc of this book. Now, I was not a big name in 2016. I am not a big name now, so the odds of me getting the arc really were reliant on either getting it at Book Expo or it coming into the store I worked at and being able to snap it up. But to my recollection, I don't think we even got any arcs sent to the store. And so this was already kind of positioned to be a very big title for the season it came out in 2016, and I cannot remember the exact season. And this makes sense because this is a twisting of Tudor history, which is something that I, as a reader, have already been very interested in and have this perception that other readers, especially in the YA space, are interested in. And it was this irreverent take on history, this humorous take on history, and was a kind of a breath of fresh air in that. And of course, additionally, there was a sprinkling of magic. And we were taking a historical figure that doesn't get as much recognition and twisting her story and giving her back agency within her story, while also being on a little bit of a madcap romp that translates so well to screen. And what a rollicking good time the show was, as well, as I have seen it pick up steam on social media outside of the context of it starting as the novel My Lady Jane, which means it's resonating with new viewers. And part of that resonating involves changing a decent amount of the story, which I honestly expected. I expected to take the bare bones conceit of the book into the show, but that's all I honestly expected to see transposed onto the show. That doesn't mean there weren't elements I found myself missing while watching the show, but it makes sense when we talk about taking this from the page to the screen, because we already have this conceit that is set up, like I said, with this irreverent humor, and so it's already perfectly positioned to be speaking to modern audiences, because that's what it's aiming to do in the book as well, though I did have to do the math and realize that teens that read this book when it came out in the YA space are now full adults, and that's just something I'm going to have to continually grapple with probably every year. But we've got a book that already has like modern references. There is a reference to the Red Wedding in the book. There is a reference to one of my favorite lines from Monty Python, lines that don't make it into the show, but definitely have that modern sensibility. And we see that translate so easily then to the screen in the way that the visual and kind of design language of this show is set up in terms of how it looks. It doesn't need to be exact to the period, as well as the music direction in particular, which I really loved, and not just because there were 2 covers of Kinks songs and a Griff cover featured in the season, but I thought it very much spoke to the spirit of what this season was exploring. Now, in terms of the plot itself, like I said, there are some major deviations, especially in relation to the kind of focus of the narrative. The book and the show are both titled My Lady Jane, which implies a focus on Jane Grey and her adventure, but the book is actually split between 3 3 distinct points of view. And while I haven't really watched a whole lot of interviews with the authors talking about the writing process of this book, my assumption would be that each author had a point of view that they were writing. And so while the show starts directly into Jane's point of view, in the book, we are actually with Edward and realizing that he is about to die. Now, from the book point of view, I think this actually makes a lot of sense because as a reader, one, it gives us some of that exposition, and two, if we are readers of Tudor history and Tudor fiction, which I was, especially in my young adult era, and I grew up on the Royal Diaries, Elizabeth I's Royal Diaries, which we may circle back to at some point if I remember. But so we're starting from kind of what is known and looking at this succession as Edward is sick and presumably dying, and then moving to Jane and Guildford. But then we have this extra layer of magic. And so we have this conceit that Jane is being married off to Guildford Dudley as per the historical record. But where we switch it up is this idea of Ethians and Verities, and particularly Guildford's curse to become a horse during the daytime. Though in the book, he does stress to call him G. This is also the point where I should warn you that there probably will be book spoilers discussed here because I am looking particularly through the perspective of the book versus the show and how they're in conversation with each other, what story each is telling, and how that works for the TV show, and what I find successful, what I like, what I may miss, etc., etc. But it just gives a kind of starting point in terms of discussing the thing. So I can't promise that there will not be spoilers. But in the book, we are following this poisoning attempt on Edward. But in the book, it is in fact orchestrated by Dudley and not Mary. Mary still is in on it, but in that kind of convoluted court politicking where there is double crossing and betrayal. But it is very evident in the book that Dudley is setting up his son and his son's heirs, his heirs, to inherit the throne. And there are, of course, a lot more deviations from there, including the kind of structure of the thing. The book is told in 2 distinct parts, and we do follow Jane in her time as an erstwhile queen, but she is always kind of foisted into the position and trying to gain her footing. There is always the sense that she's up against this greater kind of plotting, and then we have her and Guildford's relationship, which is a lot more bickering than like enemies to lovers with that lust thrown in that we get in the show, and we will talk more about their relationship in particular later. But we have that whole time as a queen, which functions much differently than the show. And then in part 2, we are kind of on the run, but we are on the run as a group. And so we have Jane and Edward, and they end up meeting up with Edward, who has escaped, and Edward's companion that he meets along the road, Gracie, who doesn't really exist in the show in the form that she exists in the book. She has been split into 2 characters, especially with some major changes that they've made for Edward. And so the traits and functions of Gracie within the book are kind of shared between Joanna, Jane's maid, who is on the run with the pack as an Ethian, and I am very grateful to the show for saying Ethian so much, because even with the pronunciation laid out very clearly at the beginning of the book, my brain just was not holding on to it. And then Fitz, who in the show becomes Edward's romantic interest, because in the book, Gracie is Edward's romantic interest. And so we have a queering of Edward's storyline in a really fun way. And I actually wish we had a more prominent Edward, similar to how we did in the book, because Jordan Peters' Edward was just so delightful, and it struck such a perfect balance in relation to the tone of the show, of being very tongue-in-cheek, but also grounded at the same time. And I think it was just masterful, and I would have liked to play with that character more, especially because we do get them more as a kind of ragtag group in the book, including Bess, who isn't as present in the show, which I think is evidence further evidence that they are setting up a season 2, which we will need to discuss a little bit more at the end of this discussion. But as a woman who got into Tudor history based on Queen Elizabeth and early Elizabeth narratives like the Royal Diaries, and knowing how they handle Elizabeth in the book, I really would have loved more of her. Additionally, in terms of deviations that aren't quite as big as the next big thing I really want to jump into to start the real meat of the discussion, while Jane and Bess were both changed from redheads, and so we don't get the running jokes about Jane's red hair, which I think actually makes sense. They remove a lot of the running jokes about personal appearance. For instance, in the book, there is this running joke about the Dudley nose and how Guildford hasn't actually inherited the Dudley nose, and that's part of why he's so attractive, and how plague masks were actually modeled after the Dudley nose. So I get why we move away from jokes about personal appearance, because I think even within the 8 years since the book came out, that is something that we're pulling away from, even if the jokes in the books never felt fully mean-spirited. But I do not have a plague mask-esque nose, so I don't get to make calls, and that probably is a little bit more mean-spirited than the redhead jokes, which actually were pretty tame coming from someone who grew up as a redhead in the 2000s. But despite this change, I'm still claiming this as a win for the redheads, especially in a season where we just came off of Bridgerton season 3 with a redheaded heroine. So I think the spirit still stands. So let's circle back to the plotting of the show, the shape of the thing, the major changes, looking at Jane in particular. And again, there's a lot of liberties for change within the show because the book itself is very open about the fact that it is throwing history out the window. And so we have this kind of irreverence, but the show seems to definitely be in more conversation with modern audiences, while the book seems to be interested in kind of flipping that history and kind of riffing on flipping that history. And I think that this is most evident in the use of verities and Ethians within both, which are vastly different despite the fact that the given circumstances of that are largely the same, notably in relation to Guildford's curse. However, there are some really big changes in relation to other Ethians within our cast in the book that, at least in season 1, that is never explored as part of them, which I found really interesting, especially when the show seems to be exploring this idea of Ethians and verities as this kind of stand-in exploration for bigotry and fully accepting oneself. There is, of course, the ability to read queer subtext into this, even if it is more of the main text in other parts of the show, which I found really interesting because I had a friend who started watching it as I was still doing my reread, and so we were kind of talking about it, and I hadn't yet seen what the show was, and so she was talking about that subtext, which to me isn't as evident in the book. I definitely think it is still there. You can still read that into it and build from it, but it is so much more of a focus in the show because in the book, the Verity and Ethian kind of conflict is a kind of funny visual representation of the Catholic Protestant conflict in this time. And I found it very interesting that this in particular seems to have been completely wiped from the show. For instance, the pack that is in both the show and the book, in the show we have the Ethians that have been exiled into the forest, very Merlin-esque, and we have this setup of the conflict with that and the pack as kind of representatives, but also these kind of marauding group. They are much more of a dangerous force in the book and kind of exploring this idea that not all Ethians are good, just as all verities are not good, and the fact that Mary is so against Ethians in the book is part of the reason she is passed over for succession. The pack, again, in the book almost is this representation of the Protestants that would sack Catholic churches, and I am no religious historian by any means, but it was much more of a stand-in for the Catholic Protestant conflict in the country at the time, because let's be real, shapeshifters are much funnier than religious conflict. And in the show, this has been kind of reconfigured into an exploration of bigotry more generally, which in the show gives Jane a little bit more focused purpose in relation to the good she thinks she can do once she is crowned queen, but also her kind of protected nature and how she doesn't fully see the world and all of the dangers of the world, particularly in Mary, who becomes this kind of oversized representation because she is much more present in this show than in the book. In the show, she is very much the antagonist, the villain, a cartoonish villain, a Queen of Hearts-esque villain, which is kind of ironic because in the book there is a reference to the Queen of Hearts with Margaret Beaufort, who is much more present and present in a much different context. And so in the show, Jane has a kind of direction, even if she really is still very reactionary in a lot of what she's doing. And this feels ungenerous, and it's not, because I really did enjoy Jane. It made me think about when we talked recently about the new retelling of Eros and Psyche, Psyche and Eros by Luna McNamara, in which we kind of reimagined Psyche as a hero within the Greek sense and kind of reshaped her character around that. And in some ways I feel like we've done similar things to Jane and Guildford in this show. We have the kind of outlines of them. They still have their spirit and their heart, but we are very much kind of leaning into this enemies to lovers, this instant attraction. They're kind of fighting it off over the course of the show. The kind of intimacy is much quicker in the show. There are running jokes throughout the book of kisses getting interrupted from both Guildford and Jane, and also Edward, because it is kind of exploring that awkwardness of young adulthood, especially for these characters who are so young. And so it really emphasizes that they're kind of bumbling and they don't know. There is a running joke about Jane just reading all the time, which does start to get kind of old, admittedly. That in itself is kind of Jane's defining character trait, and so she can feel a little flat in the book as well, absolutely. But we see that kind of transposed in the show into the fact that, like, she knows medicine and she's an herbalist, though that really only comes up at really convenient plot points, it feels like. But there is an attempt to still reference that kind of bookishness, but it doesn't have the same awkwardness to it. We have that same naivete and the idea that this character is kind of seeing the larger world for the first time and the mistakes that happen because of that. But in especially the beginning of the book, there's a lot of reactionary and this idea that she thinks that she has power that she doesn't really have because of the machinations of these advisors. And the show was leading us to believe that she has a lot more of this power. And so it is empowering in that way, especially when framed against this idea of self-love and combating bigotry. But I do sometimes miss that awkwardness and that quirkiness. We get the same from Guildford, who in the show is portrayed as a rake, and we first meet him at a tavern, though he does spew out some poetry at that first meeting, which made me think at first that we were going to get the Guildford of the book. But we do kind of shift into him being more of the perception of Guildford that Jane has, that kind of suave, rakish womanizer, when in the book that is all a cover for him to sneak into taverns and read bad poetry, or maybe good poetry. Maybe I'm not giving him enough credit. And toward the end of the book, he starts spewing out lines of Shakespeare as if he has come up with these lines. We do see a throwaway line from Mary in the show in a similar vein, so we have an allusion to it, but it is not part of Guildford's personality per se. And so I do sometimes miss that awkwardness and that bumbling, though especially within the shape of the show, we are much more focused. So we kind of go throughout the 9 days period of the 9 Days a Queen, as well as the follow-up in leading up to what would be Jane's beheading. Now, in the book, we escape from the tower and we deviate from that. So the tones are much different, especially in that, and the pacing then is much different in the show than in the book. I'm not saying one is necessarily better than the other, because they both have strengths and weaknesses, and I do think both have moments of flagging. I think that there is a great moral center to the show, and it's funny and it's over the top, but sometimes it does kind of veer a little bit more into that parody and that extremism, and because there isn't as much nuance, especially in relation to that conflict between the Verities and the Ethians, or that we as viewers haven't gotten to spend as much time with the Ethians as Ethians. Their contexts are completely different in both. It just feels a little broader there. Now, there are other changes then that are a lot more focused. For instance, the use of Mary as the prime antagonist, so that it's a little bit more of a centralized villain and an over-the-top, almost cartoonish villain at times, and then there were moments where I kind of struggled with that portrayal and whether I felt it had veered too far into the outlandish. But at the same time, I think it is drawing a parody of the kind of extremism of bigotry, and a lot of the plotting is drawing direct parallels to the current moment in terms of bigotry and playing to power and going against your own interests for the sake of power. Though there are parts of me that wishes we had drawn the world of the Ethians a little clearer, because our only real interaction with Ethians from a character perspective, like I said in the show, is Guildford, who very much hates that part of himself and is searching for a cure, which is very different than the book, because in the book, Guildford has kind of acquiesced to his fate. Now, the backstory of his curse is very different in both, because in the book, his mother is not dead. There is a lot of playing with history there, though we have the license to play with history as we will in this. And so by that nature, we are given a lot of the exposition of the Ethians through like the scenes of the camp or through blatant exposition. And let's go back to this idea of blatant exposition, because I have not talked about the narrator at all. Now, usually in an adaptation, I am not very pro narrator because I think it is just a lazy and cheap way to give exposition. And I'm not saying that doesn't have its moments here, but because the narrator is so tongue-in-cheek and is a direct commentator on the action, I actually went into the show even before having seen it, one, expecting a narrator, partly because we get that narrator in the book as well, and so it's already kind of baked into the story, but it is that extra layer of humor. And it is interesting because in some cases you could have done it as the narrator being the majority of the humor, that kind of tongue-in-cheek commentary, but we still have that kind of like outlandishness in the tone of the show, whether it's characters flipping the bird or Mary giving instructions while using her chamber pot or the privy. And so we do still have that sense of humor throughout in an even more extreme way than we get it in the book. Though there are a couple of surprise moments where the show has a little bit more modesty than the book, because in the book, when Ethians change, they do not have clothes, which admittedly is much easier to maneuver in the imagination of your mind than on screen. But when we go back to this idea of narrator, it makes sense. And I do love the way that it's utilized. I do think it kind of falls off a little bit more at certain points, but overall I think it's really balanced. However, I do have a major critique in that the narrator is a man. In this narrative, in the show where we really recentered women, and I know that sounds silly to say because it is a kind of reclaiming, or is a reclaiming, of the history of Jane Grey, but like I said, in the book we have these three distinct point of views, and two of them are Edward and Guildford. However, in the show we are very specifically in Jane's point of view, and we have built up other women characters around her a lot more, with the exception, of course, of Bess, which maybe that is being established for a potential season 2, but we definitely have made her mother a central player, and those machinations a much randier Portia Featherington. In a world of adaptations where we see siblings often cut from narratives, we have actually given Jane her sisters back in the show, as well as, again, making Mary the central antagonist of the show. So we really are centering the stories of these women and what it means to survive at this court, and the choices that these women are making, which we are seeing with Jane, but also with her sisters, Catherine and Margaret. And so to have this narrator that is a man was just a very interesting choice to me. And maybe it is trying, or was trying, to present that kind of opposite. However, it just felt a little wrong to me, and I was a little bummed. I think because I know the authors of the book, and the authors of the book are kind of a character in and of themselves within the book, so they're speaking as the authors, but there is this sense that it's the character of the authors. But even so, I have always imagined that voice as a woman's voice, and in this show that seems to be about that reclaiming of women's voices and how women's voices were somewhat limited at this time, it seems like a missed opportunity in relation to using the narrator as the voice, especially because then it also reads as inner dialogue in some way, or the kind of subconscious, and I think that there would have been something really interesting there. Now let's talk about the humor for just a second. Now, I am notably no comedic expert, but I think it is of note that while the tone and kind of inspiration is obviously pulling from the book, that this is a much more grown-up version of that, and almost like it is for those who grew up with the book when they were young adults and are now of age, because it does have a lot more coarseness and crudeness, and I'm not just speaking of intimate acts, when the humor of the book was a little bit more in the vein of, let me indulge me in reading this brief passage. "My lord, I apologize for the horse joke. If you put down the book unharmed, I will give you a carrot." He brandished the book at her. Was that a horse joke? Nay. Was that a horse joke? And so there is a lot more puns, or there are a lot more puns, I would argue, in the book, those references, when the show is living a lot more in that kind of over-the-top tone and really playing on that coarseness as part of the humor. Now, I have talked about the shock value of things like this primarily in relation to lit fic and using that to elicit a reaction and whether it feels cheap in certain circumstances. And here it could kind of teeter because it felt like the humor was doing a lot of the work at times. However, I did really enjoy the tone of this. We knew that it was over the top. It didn't take itself too seriously, which it can't when there are shifters at play, right? Though, again, I do wish that some of the maneuvering of the shifter subplots had been a little bit more cohesive, especially if they were changing them anyway, because I'm not saying that the book was perfect in it, but we do have this kind of outlandishness. Now, in relation to that, in the way that the book really emphasizes the banter in particular between Guildford and Jane in the show and their relationship really seem to anchor the kind of emotional center of everything a little bit more. And there's still banter there, but we can feel the attraction and the tension behind it, which we can feel to a lesser degree in the book, as these characters, like I said, are a little bit more awkward and still figuring themselves out. And so in the show, that is a little bit more of the kind of guide, and we're exploring that relationship and getting over the idea of Jane wanting to leave the marriage, as well as Guildford accepting himself. And so there's a little bit more going on there. Though by the end of the season, when Guildford goes off to find a cure, kind of mimicking an emotional distance that they have in the book after Jane refuses to make him king because she doesn't know if she can trust him, because his father is behind a lot of this plotting, and there are hurt feelings therein because he doesn't think she trusts him, this and that and the other, but they are still in the same physical proximity for a lot of this. We see a separation more physically from them in the show as well, while Guildford is off trying to find a cure for his atheism that Jane has told him there's no cure for, and she accepts him as he is. There's really not that same exploration of the curse of him being a horse all day and a man at night to the same degree as there is in the book, because in the book it's about kind of gaining control of that aspect of it and not being kind of burdened by those times of day. And we also get to see Jane and Guildford getting to know each other a little bit more organically over the course of the book in that way, and we have some time that they spend together while he is a horse on their honeymoon, which is much more abridged here just from the plotting perspective, which makes sense, though I would have liked to see or have a little bit more time with them, especially when we have that distance toward the end of the season, and that is so central to the plot of the season. Additionally, there was a slight missed opportunity. In the book, they set a number of ground rules. All of Jane's have to do with not misusing books. However, Guildford has basically set out these rules that she cannot ride him, they cannot saddle him, this, that, and the other. And so we had the perfect opportunity to play on that, especially with the grand shot of her riding off on Guildford at the end of episode 8. And, you know, there's some other moments of writing in the show. However, there is at the beginning of their relationship this distance and this conflict that we have seen the initial immediate attraction between the two. And so some of it doesn't feel as organic because we don't get as much time with them together. We know that they're both very headstrong characters, but this is where I felt them kind of deviating from their book characters a little bit more, and we were getting that kind of enemies to lovers energy without really grounding that enemies to lovers energy. However, I do think the given circumstances of Jane and her independence and her want and desire of independence really does do a lot of work there. I'm not discrediting that by any means. In relation to their relationship, though, especially when Guildford was away, there were a couple of moments where it felt like we were hinting at a potential love triangle with Archer, and I'm glad we didn't fully act on that. That was making me nervous. I understood in relation to the book, there is like a running joke that Guildford thinks that Jane and Edward may be more than cousins, or like what kind of kissing cousins you could be at the time, and some jealousy there, even though they are of course just best friends. But I could see them trying to translate that to a different party in the show, but they also didn't really use that at all. So that may be something they're setting up for the future. I'm gonna hope not. But in relation to Edward too, I did love that we still got his relationship with Jane, because we pulled back a lot and his subplot was kind of on his own. I do wish we had gotten more of it. I miss some of that kind of band of oddballs energy, though I do understand the kind of centralization of the plotting in relation to keeping Jane at court and it feeling like the stakes are higher there. We have the kind of constraint of time and place, when in the book we're kind of dashing all over because we can go wherever we want in a book within the change of a paragraph. But the kind of centralization of the plot in the show does make a lot of sense, even if we have to sacrifice some of our hijinks. But I'm glad that we still do get a decent amount of Edward, and that his relationship with Fitz on his kind of side quest does mirror his early relationship with especially Gracie in the book a lot. The mechanics of it move a lot quicker because in the book there is a lot of time spent on him not getting to kiss Gracie, and he is very focused on getting to kiss a girl in the book, which I think could have been translated to just anybody in the show, especially as he was kind of coming into his own and realizing life outside of the palace as this king who had always been sickly and had never really gotten to explore life outside. But like I said, I just found King Edward a real gem and highlight of the season. Now, we did notably end the season much differently than the book. Not differently in the fact that Jane Grey is alive, and I did really enjoy the kind of mirroring of that famous painting of Jane Grey from the beginning and how it is kind of turned on its head in those illustrations within the narration at the beginning, and then mirroring that imagery with Jane in the climax of episode 8. I thought that was really well done. However, in the book, we have escaped from the tower much earlier, and I was starting to get nervous about spending any time in the tower, which I recognize sounds absurd, but it's kind of a fixture of these kinds of narratives. But I do understand why we left it to that last episode once it came into play. So in the show, we leave off with Jane having escaped, but Mary is still on the throne. In the book, we overturn the succession, though I'm not going to tell you how, which I believe, especially in relation to the dialogue we have between Jane and Guildford at the end of the episode, at the end of the season, that we are leaving the door open for a season 2. And I've seen some buzz online about a season 2, especially with the great reception to this season. And so if we do get a season 2, I think we're going to see even greater deviations from the book. Though, let me know if you'll still be interested in talking about this if it's not based on any specific book come season 2. I think that we are leaving the door open to set up that kind of tussle for the throne, and I think there's one of two ways that we could go here. I think I saw a quote from someone involved in the production intimating that there are a lot of interesting historical characters in this era, which is true. But we could either stay with Jane, as Jane is either a side player or more of a central figure in some of the historical events that happen after, or we could switch focus to Elizabeth, to Bess, especially as we see her reveal revealed as an Athean at the end of the show, which was not a surprise to anyone who has read the book, other than the fact that in the show she is a fox instead of a cat. So they switch Fitz and Bess in terms of their animals. In the book, Gracie is a fox and Bess is a cat, and so in the show we see Bess as a fox and Fitz as a cat, which I think is very interesting, and I could see Bess being either, but I think with this, they're wanting to highlight Bess's cleverness, potentially, and that could be setting her up for a more central focus in the second season, especially as I find it very odd that she is not more of a focus in this season, and I would have liked to see more of her plotting and her leadership that we do admittedly get tastes of in the book, especially as I love Elizabeth so much. And so that is leaving the door open for that, especially with the conflict we saw between Bess and Mary in the season, especially as that is reflective of a lot of the tensions and kind of precarious nature of Bess's existence at the time. Now, I lose track of my Seymours, so I don't think that the Seymour that we saw here, the Lord Seymour, is Thomas Seymour. It could be, though. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm always willing to view Thomas Seymour as a villain, because he is a villain despite how Six paints him, though that is just because of the snapshot in time we are looking at in that musical. If you like Six, you will also like this show. If you have seen this show and loved it, you should check out Six the Musical, which is a musical based on the wives of King Henry VIII, and I did a reading recommendations video for that musical that included My Lady Jane, but I think that those are two really notable directions that season 2 could go. Now, I wish that we could be a little bit more experimental, because we do have this series that kind of jumps around, right? So if we stay within the world of the Janes, we move to Jane Eyre and Charlotte Bronte next. We do not stay in the Tudor realm. However, within the Mary series, we do get Mary, Queen of Scots, and so we could have brought her in. However, while she is brought in the book, we do not see her introduced within any context in the show, so it would have been a little bit more jarring to bring her in and switch focus in that way. And as much as I think streaming really sets up or gives us the opportunity to be more experimental in our storytelling in relation to adaptations like this, I unfortunately think that what we've seen with Bridgerton is proving that general audiences still aren't ready for that, and I can understand that as well. You get emotionally attached to a storyline, to characters. To completely switch that is very jarring, but I think also really interesting, especially as a book lover. But at the same time, I would like to spend more time in this world as well, and I was a little sad at the end of my Contrary Mary, which I did do a feature Friday on back in the day, kind of left the world of Verities and Atheians behind. But like I said, we've got a much different world of Verities and Atheians here. However, if we do move into a season 2, I think that we will continue to expand that. So I think that this was very much a setup to continue exploring this world. I will be interested to see if we take elements from the book that we didn't explore as much in this first season and save them for future seasons. Like, will we see Edward and Jane and Bess and Guildford maybe on the run at the beginning of season 2? So kind of taking the part 2 of the book and putting it in to season 2. And with that, in terms of expanding the world of the Atheians and the role of the Atheians, it also offers the opportunity to continue to explore and build these characters and get them to understand themselves more. Will some more of our characters reveal or present as Atheians in season 2 that wasn't part of their journey in season 1, but that maybe was part of their journey in the book? That I would be very interested to see, because if we are playing this longer game, I definitely then think that the pacing and the plotting of this is even smarter. And even if not, I think it still ups the stakes in this season. Now, are there moments where we veer on the edge of didactic? Absolutely. However, I think, again, the irreverence, the tone, the tongue-in-cheek nature, the crudeness actually help with that because it balances things out. It tells us as a viewer that the show isn't taking itself too seriously, and so it kind of buffers a little bit of that. And I will also say this, one thing that I think the show gets really right is that it really commits to its decisions, its artistic direction. It knows what it is and what it wants to be, and so I think that it is unapologetic in that presentation, and I think that that is part of why as a viewer we buy in, or I bought in so well. I love the way, especially like I said, the music folds within this show and kind of underscores everything. It feels in some ways like in another era this would have been a hit on the CW, in which case the pacing definitely would have had to be altered. But I love that we have especially all of these covers of rock songs from really hot female artists right now. It feels like a soundtrack that I would have bought and played over and over again on my boombox in the bath in another era. And so I think that that is a real strength as well. It is very much in line with this idea of period pieces that are pulling from the modern moment that we've seen in things like Bridgerton or The Buccaneers, but it's got a very distinct vision and it commits to that vision. And then I think for me that it is a little bit more successful in that than something like The Buccaneers. However, again, this source material is already written for modern audiences, and so it's not kind of chafing against that interpretation and that vision. And I also enjoy when choices are made, when there is a vision, when artists take risks in telling a story and have a clear direction that they are going, a clear story that they are telling with those creative choices, with the design choices. But here, because we are already playing fast and loose with the history, we know that from the beginning, and we have something that is so over the top in terms of tone, that offers a little bit more wiggle room for me as a viewer in relation to things like dialect choices or costuming choices. There is no presumption of complete veracity from me as a viewer, and so I'm able to enjoy how it is playing with the period and the story rather than expecting it to follow it exactly. And so in that way we have a source material that is already in conversation with the story and the history, and now we have a show that is in conversation with that book and the original history at once, that are pulling on things a little differently at times in relation to the angle of the story that is being told. But I feel like we've centralized it a little bit more in the show in some ways. It makes sense the way we've streamlined the narrative for the screen, and while I would have liked to see some of those more nuanced explorations, particularly in relation to the explorations of the Verities and the Atheians, that is not to say that that is not still possible in the future, though I do think that the way the pack is explored is already going to be fundamentally changed. But at the end of the day too, I think this show also just kind of hit at the right time. I think culturally we are really enjoying kind of modernized period pieces right now, especially with a romantic angle, and that the show has such a specific vision of itself and that it is unapologetic for that vision. Maybe the shifters don't hurt in the current landscape as well. I also think that the kind of myriad of explorations of women in the show is very appealing, and while that definitely did sound like a kind of conclusion or wrap up, there are a couple of specific moments that I want to bring attention to or give my specific thoughts on, so hold tight for 1 second if you will. In the interim, go ahead and like and subscribe if you have not done that yet, because it means a lot, and of course comment your thoughts below as you have them. But there is a line from Edward where he says, "I always thought marriage sounded rather fun," which is a wild thing to say as the son of King Henry VIII. And the way King Henry VIII is alluded to in this is kind of fun because we have Mary's obsession with him, which doesn't totally fit because she had a lot of resentment toward her father for divorcing her mother and all that jazz. But we do not get the kind of Lion King jokes, probably for copyright reasons, that we get in the book, because in the book King Henry VIII turns into a lion and eats a court jester because he is an Athean. But Lion King jokes are not, though Dudley does still have a line telling Edward or someone that they have the strength of 1,000 lions. 1,000 lions? I guess 1,000 lions. I still think that that is a wild statement from a child of King Henry VIII. In terms of the editing, we have a lot of like page swipes, which I do think makes sense within the tone of the show, but were a little jarring for me because I would have failed my beginner editing class in college for using those page swipe transitions. In terms of editing as well, I did enjoy that for the period that Jane was queen, we changed the title card from My Lady Jane to My Queen Jane, and then switched it back after she had lost the crown. I thought that that was a really fun little detail and showed the precarious nature of everything and fit in with the sense of humor of the show. I really enjoyed that detail. The moment in episode 6 where a nun has Fitz in a bag and drags out Edward's name, I don't know if it was because I was watching that really late at night, like it was the last episode I watched before going to bed, or I wasn't fully paying attention, I don't know, but that moment legitimately creeped me out for a second. In relation to the crudeness of the humor, because I don't know if I ever finished that thought earlier, sometimes I do think it is trying a little hard, admittedly, but I do think it still fits within the context and the voice of the show, so it ultimately wasn't too alienating. Like I mentioned in the book, we get references to things like The Lion King, or Game of Thrones, or Monty Python and the Holy Grail. In the show, we did get a reference to Rodgers and Hammerstein, specifically A Cockeyed Optimist, and I did have to stop myself from starting to sing the song, so I did appreciate that reference for all the theater nerds. But ultimately, this was just a lot of fun, and I'm just really excited to see that adaptations like this are still picking up steam and gaining popularity, and I hope this directs more people to the book as well, because like I said, they are very different entities. If you were expecting the same edginess from the show in the book, it's not quite to that extreme, but if you enjoyed the show, I definitely think the book, or any of the other books, are worth checking out, if for nothing else than for the sense of humor. Now, I'm sure I could keep dissecting this. I really barely touched on most of these characters, but for now, I'm going to leave it at that and would love to hear what you thought of this show, if you enjoyed it, if you read the book or not, if you have, how you think they're in conversation with each other, but I definitely do not think you have to read the book to enjoy this show. Ultimately, a good adaptation, you don't have to have read the book to enjoy the show or the movie, period. But again, this is a book channel and I am a dramaturg by trade, so I'm very interested in how stories are told and how the translation of a story from a book to the screen or to the stage works. So that is why we kind of look at things through that lens here. But I ultimately think that this was a very successful adaptation in that way, in the sense that it was still in the vein of the spirit of the book for sure, and took a lot of the central pieces still, which is not always the case. Case in point, Ella Enchanted, as mentioned earlier. Though, if we had to have a male narrator in this one, I wouldn't have minded Eric Idle either, I guess. I didn't mind the narrator. Anyway, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you for hanging out and listening to mine. Again, like I said, like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.